Hello, this is AMET 104 lecture recording week 3.2. So last class we talked about percentages. So last class we went over how to convert the decimal to percentage, raw score to percentage, also the fraction ratio to percentage, and we also looked at a few different examples, including percentage increase, percentage decrease, and to find the baseline, future value, and all that. We did a few examples back then, and I think the topic is self-explanatory and it's easy enough for you. So I don't think I'm going to dedicate today going over more examples on percentages. So instead, knowing the knowledge that we just acquired from percentage, that's 10.1. Let's go over to 10.2 today. So 10.2 is simple interest. So the simple interest is going to be a very easy, yet it's going to be a very important chapter because this is the foundation of the topics that we're going to learn later. So what is interest? Let's define a few things first. So the interest is the price someone pays for the use of someone else's money or asset. So in this chapter, we're mainly going to look at the money because we're more interested in the calculations of the interest rather than the payments. So for example, the interest in real life, that's some examples that you might be very familiar with would be at the rental cost. So for example, renting a car, you have to pay the rental fee, and that is in a form of it is interest because you're using someone else's asset for the fee. You're paying for something, but you're not buying it. So you're actually renting it for some fee for some period, and that's called that's basically what the interest is. Another example would be renting an apartment. I know in normal situations that if you are commuting students to school, you probably have an apartment that you're renting, and the rental cost that you're paying, you're not buying anything, but you are paying for your housing for the period that you're staying in there. So that's in a way also a form of interest. Yeah. So those are some sort of examples. But in this class, we're not going to talk about assets too much. We're going to talk about money. Similarly, if you have some sort of student loan, the financial company would require from you to pay some sort of interest on top of the initial money that you borrowed, and that is what the interest is. So before we do anything, let's actually define a few things. There are a lot of different terms a lot of new terms that we haven't talked about so far in this chapter. So the first thing is the principle. and it's going to be denoted the big P. I know in an earlier chapter we used the big P, the capital P, to denote the percentage, but that was only for that chapter, and from now on, the capital P would almost always indicate the principal. So what is principal? It's not the headmaster of a high school. It is a word that you use to describe the sum of money that the lender lends the borrower. So, for example, if you, let's say, borrow $500 from your friend, the principal will be $500. The next thing we want to talk about is interest rate. And this is denoted with the smaller r. So the interest rate, I'm sure some of you are already aware of this term, is the rate paid by the borrower to the lender for the use of the principal. Principal P. So however much money you borrow from the lender or you borrow to someone, the interest rate is the rate where the borrower pays the lender. And there's another thing that you have to talk about is for a specific unit of time. Usually in this chapter, we're going to talk about larger time frame, and a lot of the times it's in the unit of year. So we talk about so when the interest rate is expressed as a percentage of the principal and the unit is a year, this rate is called annual percentage rate. In other words, this would often be abbreviated to APR. If you apply for a credit card, if you apply for your first credit card, or if you have a student loan, APR is something that you probably have already heard of. APR is simply the interest rates that you owe to the lender if you borrow money and it's calculated for, it's the term that we use if the term unit of the term is 1 year. So APR is how much interest we pay for each year, kind of thing. So now that we talked about the principal and the interest rate, and since you already talked about the unit of time, the next factor that we need to consider is the term. And this is often noted as a smaller t. So the term, as the name already suggests, is the length of the time. So the length length of time the borrower is borrowing. The money. And this term obviously can be any length of term. It could be month, so it could be month, days, years, and so on and so forth. But you should all be aware that when you are given the APR, since this APR stands for annual percentage rate, if you are given the term in a different unit, you always have to change to years. But in the case where the interest rate is not given as APR, it can be any different unit of time. So what is simple interest? So the simple interest that this whole chapter is going to go over, so the simple interest is when the interest rate is applied only to the principal P. And in other words, in this case, the interest paid on the loan per unit of time is constant. And there's another type of, excuse me, another type of interest. There is this called compound interest. So simple interest is what we're going to talk about today, and compound interest is actually 10.3, which we'll learn after this chapter. But just to give you a little overview of what a compound interest is when the interest interest accumulates. So in other words, you first pay interest on the principal, and next you pay interest on the principal. Sorry. Oh, sorry. So you pay principal interest on the principal and the interest. So this may sound a little confusing, but we're gonna go into more details when we're actually going over the compound interest. So in real life, not many things are actually simple interest. Simple interest is actually not as common as compound interest. I'm sure there are, but I cannot really think of examples that where the simple interest is used. But usually 9 out of 10 times in real life, if you ever borrow money or lend money to someone, it's going to be the compound interest. And this involves a little more calculation than the simple interest, but today we're only going to focus on the simple interest today. So more on that later. So let's talk about the simple interest now. So simple interest formula. So this is simply interest, where I implies the interest, equals to PRT. So what's PRT? So here, as we have already defined in the previous page here, we know that P is principal and R is the interest rate and T is the term. So if you want to find the interest I, if it's a simple interest, all you're doing is you're simply multiplying the principal and the interest rate and term. And you're multiplying the three. And in this class, when we say the interest rate, it's going to be the APR. It's going to be the annual percentage rate, and the term of the loan will be year. So when T is 2, it will mean that it's 2-year period. And when the APR is 6%, it means that you owe 6% of the principal for that specific year. So let's do some examples that will use this simple interest formula. So example. So suppose a credit union will give you a student loan under simple interest. So as I have mentioned earlier, this is not usually the case. When you are borrowing money from a credit union, bank, or any sort of financial institute, it's most likely the compound interest. So this is just for the sake of the problems, but simple interest is actually not really used. But yes, but in this ideal world, let's say that the credit union is lending you the student loan under simple interest. And let's say the APR is 6%, and the term is 3 years. And let's say, suppose you are borrowing $5,000, then at the end of the term, how much interest do you owe? So how much interest do you owe? So here we are given 3 different numbers. So we're given 6% APR, and we're given that the term is 3 years and you're borrowing $5,000. So by using the simple interest formula, we can know that the interest is found as I equals PRT, where in this case, the P is $5,000. R is the APR is 6%, but because you would have to multiply with all these numbers, it has to be in decimal. Let me rewrite that here in decimal. It's very important that you change this to decimal before you multiply. And here, T is the term, which is 3 years. So in this problem, all you have to do is plug in the PRT that you already know into this formula. So what is that? So it's 5,000 multiplied by 0.06 multiplied by 3. And if you, this is where you use the calculator to put this in, and this will actually end up being $900. So what is this 900? So this implies that in this scenario, if you're borrowing $5,000 from this credit union under the APR of 6% for 3 years, you would actually owe $900 on top of what you owe initially, on top of what you borrowed initially to this credit union. So we have calculated the interest here, but the total value that you owe, because you have to pay back the initial amount, the principal as well, the total amount you owe is the principal and the interest, which in this case is obviously you borrowed $5,000 and you owe an additional $900 just for the interest, so you have to pay back $5,900 at the end of the third year. Does that make sense? So that was quite simple. I think that was very self-explanatory. Let's keep this scenario. Let's actually keep the scenario, and let's say you're still borrowing money from this credit union, and the APR is the same, and the time of the loan is also the same. But in this case, let's say, now suppose that your interest at the end of the term is $1,000. So let's say this is 3 years after you have already borrowed the money and you have to pay back. And at the end of the term, you have just realized that you're actually paying $1,000 just for the interest. Then if this is the case, you want to find out how much you actually borrowed. So how much? So here, the interest that you're paying is now the new I, the new interest, because that is what the interest stands for. And we still know that the APR is 6%. Nothing has changed. And the term is 3. So knowing that your interest is $1,000, your APR is 6%, and the term is 3 years, and you're trying to find how much you borrowed. So in other words, this is asking how much what your principal is. So let's use the simple interest formula again, PRT. So we know here that I equals to I equals to 1,000, R equals to 0.06, and T equals to 3. So before we do anything, let's actually plug in everything that we know. So then we will have 1,000 equals to, for some P that we don't know, we have 0.06 multiplied by 3. So I'm sure now you know how to isolate the P and solve for P. So I'm going to skip all these little calculations. But if for any steps that I skipped, which I don't think is necessary to go over every little step for every little problems that I do, if you have any questions or comments, please contact me through email. If you solve this for P using some simple arithmetic, it should be approximately 5, 6. So what does this mean? This means that if under these terms, under APR of 6% and for 3 terms, if your interest turned out to be $1,000, your principal, the money that you borrowed in the beginning of the term, is actually $5,555.56. And that's actually how you calculate this. So let's now talk about something else. So far we have talked about the cases where you are the borrower. You're actually borrowing money from someone or some financial institute. But what if you are the one borrowing the money? I mean, sorry, you're the one lending the money. Let's talk about this term. So let's say bond. Or this is also similar to CD, which is certificate of deposit. So when you buy a bond or when you are buying a CD, and the problem on Pearson, it's just going to say CD. It's not going to say certificate of deposit. So please understand the term here. That's why I'm defining here. So you're lending your money to the agency issuing the bond or CD. This agency can be the government, let's say, it could be muni, it could also be corporate, it could also be a bank. So any institute that you're simply lending the money to them. And typically the bond or CD is defined by the face value, the term, and APR. So we already know what the term and the APR is. The term here is the T. APR, we know that is R. And the face value here, we're gonna define it as the big F. And the face value is simply the money that you'll get back. Obviously, there's principal. The principal is the money that you loan to them. So let me just write the principal. So the principal is the money that you loan to them, and the term is the length that you loan the money to them, and the APR is the rate. And the face value is simply defined as this, is the money that you actually get back. So the face value amount you get back at the end of the term. So it's the same concept as the previously we talked about how much you owe in total, and it's exactly the same thing, but just has a different name for it. So in this case, the base value is defined as P plus PRT, and we know that PRT is obviously the same as P plus the interest there was. And using some simple arithmetic, we should be able to find that this is actually the same as P equals to F equals 1 plus RT. There is no trick involved in this. It's simple arithmetic. You should be able to do this. Please take your time to do it. So simply from here, you are solving this for P, and this is what you should get. So let's do an example about the bond or the CD. So suppose you have the opportunity to buy a 5-year bond with a face value let's say $1,000 with an APR of 3.25%. Then how do you find the original price of the bond? So here, the problem states that for however much that you bought the bond for, or in other words, however much you lend the agency, you got back $1,000. That's what you know. You've got back $1,000 in 5 years, and the APR is 3.25%. So knowing that fact, how do you find the original price of the bond? So how can you find how much you actually borrowed the agency? Lend to the agency. So here, let's use the formula for the face value. So we know that the face value is the principal plus the interest. And we also know that the interest is PRT. In this case, you can simply use this term on the right-hand side, but actually let's take this opportunity to find this relationship. So on the right-hand side, we have two P's. And since we want to solve for P, you want to take out the like terms like this, RT. And now you simply divide each side by 1 plus RT. So you end up with P equals to F over 1 plus RT. So now we already have this. So knowing this, and knowing in this problem, the face value is $1,000 and the APR in decimal is 0.0325, and make sure this is a decimal. And the term is given here as 5 years, so simply 5. So if you plug everything in, you will end up with 1,000 over 1 plus 0.0325 multiplied by 5. So you need to put this into the calculator I mean, I'm sure you can do this with your hand, but it'll save you a lot of time if you put this in the calculator. And when you do this, make sure you calculate the denominator first because there are so many more terms. It's not going to work if you simply plug in these values into calculators. You're not going to get the right answer. So if you plug this into the calculator properly, you should end up with $860.22. So this simply implies that the principal, in other words, the money that you initially lend to the agency was $860.22. Let's go over one more concept. I think next class I'm probably going to go over more examples with the simple interest, but I want to go over different concepts while I'm going over the simple interest right now. So there's this term called payday loan. And there are many different ways that companies describe this, but let's say it's a payday loan. Or a lot of times this is called cash advance. So this is, let's say, a short term loan where one can borrow a small sum using a future paycheck. Or the personal check as a collateral, but it doesn't matter. So typically, the loan has to be repaid within a couple weeks. So this is the same thing as, like, really similar concept as many different types of loans that we talked about. But the only different thing is that instead of being given the APR or the term, like it's nothing like that. You're simply borrowing a small sum of money from your paycheck, from your future paycheck, and you basically have to pay back the issuing agency whenever you get back your check. So it's usually 10 days to 14 days loan, and it's also usually a very small amount of money, and it's typically the same thing, but just for a very short period of time. So let's do an example involving the payday loan. So let's actually go over a word problem, a real life example. So let's say you have a plan to go on a road trip, so with your best friend. And all you need is $400. So all you need is $400 for your share for your gas and food, lodging, and other things. But as a college student, obviously you're broke and you have no savings. So you decide to go to a cash advance company and borrow money. And this specific cash advance company says that so a cash advance company charges $15 for every $100 you borrowed. And here the term is 14 days. And say that you actually want to borrow all $400 from this company. Then how much do you actually owe? So since the company charges $5 and $15 for every $100 that you borrow, if you borrow $400, so the interest on the $400 loan is actually given as 4 times $15, and that's going to be $60. So now let's think about this. Let's now think about this. So you're borrowing $400, and let's say in 2 weeks you owe them $60 for, on top of the money that you borrowed. Doesn't sound too crazy. $60 compared to $400, it's fine normally. But let's actually calculate the APR, because here we're not given the terms in years. We're also not given the rate in APR either. Excuse me, my dogs are barking. So let's use the terms that we already know. So we know that the interest in simple interest term is given as PRT. So principal multiplied by the APR multiplied by the term in years. So here we already know that the interest is $60. So $60 interest, and your borrowing is $400. And here you want to find the APR and the term. So you should understand that the term, the T, is in years. So note that the T is in years. So you have to convert the 14-day term into years. How do you do that? So I know there are leap years, just like this year is a leap year, but let's suppose that every year we have 365. So if you want to change the term, in this case the 14 days, into 365 days, you're simply doing this. So the T in this terms where the interest is $60 and the principal is $400, it is the 14 days on 365. Do we all understand how the 14 days is only 14 over 365 in terms of a year? So this is now in the unit of year. So now that we know the term and interest and the principal, we can now calculate the R. We can now calculate the APR. So from the formula for the simple interest, let's plug in everything we know. So we know that the interest is $60, principal is $400, and we do not know the APR, but we have just found out that the T in years is 14 over 365. So now you have an equation with one variable only. So all you have to do is just solve for R. So let's actually do this together. So first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply 400, sorry, not multiply, divide 400 on each side. Then 400 should cancel out like this, and you should have R multiplied by 14 over 365 is given as 60 over 400. And now you're simply dividing the whole thing, the whole term here on each side, to end up with 60 over 400 multiplied by 365 divided by 14. So now is when you're putting this into calculator, and this is when you're getting 3.9107. So what does this mean? We've never seen R this big. R was always a decimal that's less than 1. It was always 0 point something. So this actually implies that the APR in this scenario is actually 391.07%. So that's a lot of APR. So in other words, if you borrow this from this company and you borrowed it for a year, you're actually owing 391% of what you already borrowed just for the interest on top of what you already owe. So this is not a good deal, obviously. And we can, obviously, when we're just looking at, oh, you're borrowing $400 and you're owing $60. $60 doesn't sound like it's too bad, but if you're really calculating it into rates and terms, this is nowhere near a good term. This is almost like a scam. I think today I'm going to end it here. Next class, I'm going to bring a few more examples on simple interest, and we're going to go from there. Well, thank you for joining the class, and have a great rest of the day.